What? Oh, it's recording on my side. Okay, wonderful. Okay, you ready? Can we go? All right, thanks so much for this. Thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Tiffany Willoughby Herod. We are going to be in conversation for quite some time, hopefully getting to know each other better and obviously tapping into each other's minds. It is the 23rd time of the Writer Festival, and it is happening virtually. As you know, we are on the verge of what do they call it? It's a lockdown in South Africa that's going to be starting at midnight on Thursday. So I am honored to be chatting to you online, zooming into you. As I sit here in South Africa and as you sit there in the US, we're going to be chatting a bit, just a bit of an introduction. I'm Thobeka Dlomo, as I did mention earlier, and I'm going to be talking to Dr. Tiffany Willoughby Herod, and she is an associate professor the Department of African American Studies at the University of California, and she focuses her research on Black political thought, Black radical movements, and queer and trans sexualities. Her work, a lot of it has been published in numerous scholarly publications and journals, and she's also an author of a book which we're going to talk a bit about as well in this conversation called Waste of a White Skin. And we're going to go on and on about a bit of what she focuses on in her research. So thanks again, Dr. Willoughby Herod, for your time. It's quite an honor and a pleasure to be chatting to you.
Thanks so much for doing this interview, Thobeka. It's very, very kind of you to make the time. And I'm really delighted to be part of the 23rd time of the Writer Festival. I'm a poet, as well as a scholar. And so the idea of being able to share the academic work with a group of creatives is so, so lovely. And I'm really honored for the invitation. Tell me a little bit about your connection to the festival. I'm curious.
Okay, so I'm also a media practitioner. I'm a journalist, a writer, and I do a lot of freelance work here in Durban, South Africa. I'm also very much into the arts. I do events, and I'm a DJ. I'm a broadcaster, so I do freelancing for a couple of entities, and that's how I'm connected to the festival.
That's lovely. That's really, really nice. And I don't want to not comment on the fact that it's a lockdown. This has been a really, really surreal time. My friends in South Africa are talking about, particularly the ones who are in their 30s and 40s, how it's painful actually to see the tanks moving through the streets and things. It really reminds them of terror, And I think because the history of germ warfare and genocide on these shores as well, the idea of being quarantined, as much as everyone knows it's what helps, is really frightening. It's really, really frightening.
It really is indeed. And the uncertainty of it all, I think, is the one thing that's getting to most of us as well.
Yeah.
All right, let's get into it then, Dr. Willoughby Herod. I like the fact that I'm going to get to know a bit more about your work as I chat to you in this conversation. And when I was doing my research, checking out the type of work you do, what you focus on, I have to start at the beginning. Understanding that you're raised in Detroit, Michigan, and a lot of your research is done in South Africa and the US. Tell me specifically the main reason for your focus being on what happens politically as a political scientist in South Africa and as a person who resides in the US.
Yeah, that's a really great question to start with. So I was part of a church community in Black Detroit that was very much centered in the anti-apartheid movement and in global ideas about Blackness. So from the pulpit, I learned about South African politics every Sunday as a child. We as a church, organized marches and protests because all kinds of economic injustice and racialized violence was common to my childhood growing up. And the liturgist for my church, Reverend Mangedwa Nyati, who lives in Soweto today, was part of an exile community of students that were based in Detroit, in Windsor, Ontario, some as far north as Toronto. And they would get together very regularly and talk about their own campaign to educate people around the world about the struggle against apartheid. But they didn't just come and show up at schools and have lobby days and talk to organizations. They also did things like open food pantries and open independent Black schools. And so my church was affiliated with one of these food pantries that was opened by a South African activist, anti-apartheid activist. It was called the Agape Center. And so my self and my family grew up being fed literally by anti-apartheid activists. And that kind of feeds into some of the work that I'm doing in my second book, because I think people don't really know how much good the people who were in exile were doing in the communities that they were in. There's a sister friend of mine who teaches at Eastern Michigan University named Dr. Tiffany Caesar. And she's writing about Paulo Jordan's wife, and you'll forgive me for not remembering the woman's first name and only being able to refer to her by the husband. Forgive me. But Tiffany Caesar is writing about another South African anti-apartheid activist exile who opened an independent school in Detroit. And these activists didn't just go to rural areas and towns and places all around the world and do nothing. They literally made it possible for Black people in other places to thrive and survive. So I didn't just hear about the politics of the anti-apartheid struggle. I actually was cared for, nurtured, and raised by these anti-apartheid activists. So as soon as I got to be big enough to leave the country and, got into college and made it to graduate school, the only place that I wanted to go was South Africa.
I understand that. Okay. And then, so you see, as you speak of activists doing great work in other parts of the world, and obviously, understanding what was happening in South Africa at the time, we can look at even artists, the likes of the Miriam Makebas, the Letambulus, and so on and so forth, who were literally going out to the world and saying, it's going on back home in South Africa. The international community had to be aware of what was going on, and that was back in those days, and they were spitting it as it was without any fear and anything. So I want to look at your work. A lot of people will question a lot of research that you go into and do when you write and when you do your work, and when you interrogate Black political thought, when you go into Black radical movements, and one would ask, why would you go to the radical movements, and why would you specifically highlight the Black political thought that you interrogate? But also in the same breath, we haven't seen a lot of that being interrogated, given a chance to be researched, and also given a chance to be some sort of a mindset even studied in institutions of higher learning or anywhere else. So speak to me about your specific narrative when you focus there in your research and write deeply on those.
Well, so when I first came to South Africa, I wanted to find out about the wildcat strikes that happened in the 70s. And I wanted to know more from union organizers about how they sustained a worker consciousness, how they sustained organizations when really from the 20s until the 70s, it was a criminal act to be a member of a union for a Black person. And so I have to step back a couple of steps to be able to have you understand why this was meaningful. So I talked to you before about, oh, that's my child. I talked to you before about having to rely on food pantries and being really grateful for having access to those things. And that is not because I didn't have parents who were working. My mother and father, until they divorced, they worked, they both were educators. But in order for me to get my first pair of eyeglasses, right, or to go to the dentist for the first time, my mother had to participate in strikes as a teacher. And I mean long strikes, like weeks and weeks and weeks. And I knew what it meant to have to sit at the front of the classroom on the floor and not be able to sit in a desk because I could not see, or what it meant to, be in danger of losing teeth. A godmother of mine had died when I was a very, very small child because she couldn't access dental care. And so it wasn't until I was much older that I learned that people from Detroit had participated in what's called wildcat strikes, when they realized that the unions that they had been part of really were mostly interested in deciding who got elected and who didn't get elected, as opposed to actually making sure that their membership was empowered and could really decide for themselves. Sometimes you sit down with union leadership and they're very honest and straightforward with you, and they say, okay, you need X, Y, and Z. Other times you sit down with union leadership and they tell you you're going to accept these other things that aren't as much as you need. Right now, the entire University of California system is in full-on strike mode for the graduate students. So these are people who are pursuing master's degrees and PhDs. And the university's response has been a really harsh one. It's kind of like Fees Must Fall has finally made it to North America. And we're not sure what that's going to look like. So all of this speed up and like turn to Zoom and turn to Skype and keep teaching your classes. These are not really online classes. They're remote classes. They're emergency classes, but we want to keep students there. Meanwhile, the doctors who live in my actual neighborhood are tweeting and on Instagram and on our neighborhood listserv saying we have to go to work and we're dealing with people and we don't have masks and we don't have protective equipment. So I think because I was raised in that context of people having to actually fight to hold on to their house, to get their kids eyeglasses, to have transportation that was reliable and that functioned, that's always made me think in terms of politics that work for people as opposed to politics that work for institutions. And I think that's part of the radicalism that motivates me. In this new book that I'm working on, one of the things that I learned, because I started out writing about this, one of the co-founders of the Federation of Black South African Women, Indian woman actually, Fatima Mir.
Yes.
And I mean, being from Durban, I'm sure you know much about her complicated history.
Yes.
But one of the things that I've learned about her is that she documented a series of neighborhood actions. There were these neighborhood committees from the early 80s, like 81 to 85, all around the country. And they were like Craddock Neighborhood Association, just all of these small neighborhoods. And those were the kinds of organizations that were dealing with the cost of transportation, the cost of utilities, the cost of water, people being evicted from town council homes. And these neighborhood organizations were mobilizing people at the grassroots to come together and talk about, what do I actually need? What are my actual conditions? What do we do to organize? And it was those organizations that the apartheid state came after with all force possible, because people were mobilizing to meet their own needs. So when I think about the radical, it has to do with people trying to meet their own immediate needs. And then sometimes coming to some kind of ideological, vast vocabulary, vast grammar of ideological understanding. But oftentimes, the struggle is like, can I get some food on the table
Yes.
today for my family?
Mm. You've touched a bit on what I was going to next, which is gender. And when I was listening to one of your talks you were giving, you described it quite interestingly and quite truthfully, if I do say so myself, what gender you say being a social force, an energy, and a dynamic and a power. So when we speak of you, a certain gender, or Fatima Mia, a certain gender, the work that a gender does, and then listening to how you have put it, what you describe gender to be, how important is the work you do for a Black woman living in the States and being very aware of what's going on in South Africa?
Well, it's tricky, right? Because to start from a position of like Black feminism, right? Um, it's tricky. It's really hard, and it's hard not for the typical reasons that people would think. There is some Black feminism that's primarily about like, how can we get more Black women elected? And we all know that political parties will identify their women's caucus and then put them on the side, and they can be worse than Phyllis Schlafly. Like, they can be just these totally right-wing, useless, like trotted out into the public sphere to tell everybody else to shut up and go home, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm not talking about that kind of gender. It's also tricky because sometimes when people mobilize around gender, they want you to not talk about violence. They want you to not talk about slavery. They want you to not talk about colonialism. They just want to focus on women as like a biological, reproductive, like people who have a particular category and a particular role. And I'm not talking about that either. I am talking about a set of people that consistently do the work of nurturing Black communities, of insisting that we have a relationship to nature and to God, that we have a relationship to the ancestors, that we have obligations to the ancestors, to the living and to the dead. That's part of what I mean when I'm talking about gender. And I'm also very, very concerned about the ways that in our communities, really as a result of the force of colonialism and the violence of enslavement, have borrowed aspects of gender identity that don't serve us. So, forms of hypermasculinity that, make people think they can dispose of their children, and forms of respectability politics that make people think they don't have to fight to experience joy and to pursue desire. Those are things that I'm really troubled by. And I don't want to carry those into the next generation for myself.
Mm-hmm. I'd like for you, Doctor, to take us a bit into your book, Waste of a White Skin. And in this book, there's a lot that you go into, which I, as a person who lives in South Africa, can still honestly tell you that most of it kind of still exists, although it may be disguised or being called another name today. But for all intents and purposes, it really still exists. So talk to me about you going into the research and writing this book. You speak of very interesting things that I'd like for you to just break down for the viewer, for me. And it speaks of white poverty, which is a catalyst of what we perceive to see as white, as sort of a catalyst rather for white supremacy, which we as I'm saying, we still see in South Africa in 2020. And then you go on to talk about how the elites and whiteness has always been in support and of trying to bury blackness. And this is not by any means saying, obviously, that blackness is a disease, but it's always been viewed by the elite or whiteness as something to be buried or raped in the literal and any other sense. And you go into that, you go into rape, you go into a lot of what we see now as gender-based violence in South Africa being manifestations of the workings of the powers that be, which is a fundamental principle of what we're looking at when we look at some of the things we face in South Africa today.
So I'm going to start in kind of a different place than I typically start when I talk about the book. I'm going to talk about slum clearances and the way that people try to deal with conditions like we're facing right now with COVID-19. So in the history of South Africa, on several different major occasions, town councils and state legislatures and provincial legislatures decided, okay, there's all this pressure from these racialized communities to build something like high quality housing, but we don't want to actually build housing for them. So you know what we're going to do? We're going to promise to build them housing and then get them to move, vacate the area that they live in after we've designated it a slum and said it's a really bad area. And then once we get them out, we're going to build housing for somebody else. And this happens in South Africa over and over and over and over again. And it's not just a process that happens in South Africa. One of the things that's useful about a book like mine that thinks about philanthropy and these organizations that go around the world trying to help is that because they have money and really, if you look at their principles, believe that they are more qualified to govern and they want to avoid having to be elected, they often can take the ideas about why people are poor, blaming the poor, really hating people who are poor. They can move around the world with these ideas, and they can influence policymakers who don't really have great solutions themselves. They can influence parties, political parties, that don't necessarily have great ideas or don't really want to do the work of empowering people so that they can sit down together and struggle and make mistakes and come back to the table again and try to figure out how we're going to fix concerns of poverty. So I wrote a book about the Carnegie Corporation in the 1930s. And the Carnegie Corporation today underwrites public radio and does lots of pro-democracy work all around the world, also inside the United States. But in the 1920s, much of the foundation work that they were doing, as important as it was, really only had white beneficiaries. And its quote unquote Black beneficiaries were people particularly on the African continent that were being brought into white society as servants. And so I wanted to talk about that dynamic of white philanthropy having a history of shoring up Jim Crow. And it's not just the Carnegie Foundation, it's the Rockefeller Foundation. There's been solid research on the Gates Foundation and others. I'm not saying like all philanthropy is bad. That's not what the point of the research agenda is. It's just you have to understand that philanthropy is just as important as political parties. It's just as important as elections. It's just as important as big capital. And because it cloaks itself in this kind of helping domain, it often, we don't interrogate it. We don't ask questions about.
It comes at crucial times.
Right, right. And in moments of crisis, philanthropy can be really powerful, because that's a moment when the conjuncture happens where everybody is sitting at the table and saying, we really don't know, like the shit is up, we don't know what to do. And then here rides in a person on a white horse, like we've got a solution. And typically solution is one that coheres with the interest of big capital, with the interest of people who own massive amounts of land. And what's more diabolical about the way that philanthropy works to reinforce like just the old status quo of protecting money for folks that are super wealthy is that it undermines the kind of collective survival politics that everyday people do with each other anyway. And it makes us forget that we actually do things like move to another country and open a food pantry. Because you go there and you think, God, I'm from an apartheid society. And supposedly this is after the civil rights movement. Supposedly everything is better. And these Black children are not being educated at school. And these Black families can't even survive. And these people are literally killing each other in the streets because there's no leadership and there's no one that actually is ministering to them as people and sees their dignity. That kind of philanthropy is the work that I think is what we have to be attending to and nurturing and growing community empowerment. And its artists have really the greatest capacity because you can capture the imagination. I have a historian colleague, Jessica Millward. She's a historian of Black women in slavery. She's written a lovely, lovely book about a Black woman who bought her family out of slavery. She was enslaved herself and she freed herself, and over it's just incredible actually to think about it. But Jessica was looking at DJ Nice. She was at that party that like 100,000 people went to. Here's a DJ, right? Who brought all these people together, and in the middle of this like self-isolation, quarantine, hide yourself, only pay attention to yourself, he used a method of philanthropy from the bottom up that made people just remember that you're people, remember that we have dignity and that we're worth something and that we can listen to music together. So that just, for me, what Waste of a White Skin was about was indicting the Carnegie Corporation's long history of pretending to care, and pointing to how they were able to amass enormous sums of capital through their relationship to slavery and through their relationship to industrial capitalism in the US, and then turn around and give back pennies and pretend like they were doing something.
You see, Doctor, just last night, President Cyril Ramaphosa announces the shutdown, and in the middle of his speech, he tells us that we are getting a donation from the Oppenheimers and the Ruperts, 1 billion rand each from both the families, which is, of course, a saving grace in the countries like they are great, and they're absolutely awesome. And yes, just had to put that there. In other interesting news in South Africa. So yes, I'm really looking forward to really getting more of your work so I can have a look at it. It's been quite an interesting couple of minutes chatting to you. And final question, maybe before we part, going forward, where do you foresee the human race, maybe, let me just be as broad as that, in terms of capitalism, in terms of really strong winds against humanity, against any consciousness level of just being first-base humans with one another before we even delve into anything else that we are. Where do you see us going in terms of that mission? I mean, there's a lot of us who meet one another, whether it's on the streets or chat about missions that might not be able to literally put in words, but in spirit we can feel. So where do you foresee us going with even our little contributions in the world as artists, as academics, as anything that we may be? Where do you foresee us in the near or maybe distant future, whatever we have?
I have a friend who's a scientist named Brad Werner, and he's based at San Diego, University of California, San Diego. And Brad always talks about how important it is for us to follow the lead of Mother Earth and be in solidarity with the planet. In 2018 in California, I was living in South Africa, but every day on Facebook, friends of mine who were here in the state were experiencing what was called tornado fires. Who's ever heard like those two things don't come together. They don't belong together, right? And they were wearing masks then, you know. Watching that really catalyzed something in me. And so a group of us got together. I brought together really a group of scientists, so people who work on coral and water and people who do like stuff, toxic soil science. And we started doing creative writing together. One sister wrote a children's book. There were lots of people who wrote poems. Some people wrote songs, and we did a conference of sharing that. Because one thing that I think I understand is that human beings relate to story. They relate to feeling, they relate to smell, they relate to, you know, what Lamont Horton Stallings calls funk. You know, we relate to the ears. Those are the things that leave impressions on us, you know, embodied memories on us that we can use. And so more of us have to be willing to share our work through storytelling, right? Using arts so that we can be in solidarity with the planet. I feel like the planet said, okay, let me see if I can catch their attention with fire. You know, okay, I couldn't catch their attention. You know, I caught their attention for like a month or two, but it didn't really shift how we treat each other as human beings. It didn't really like require governments to say, actually, we're not going to use people anymore to lock other people up, right? So now the earth is saying, what if I release, you know, some terrible pandemic on people that affects everybody on the planet? Maybe they'll wake up then. Storytellers, artists, painters, even the person who designed your hair that's so beautiful that you're wearing right now.
It's me, thanks.
It's you, right?
Thank you very much.
You're conveying a message of possibility. There's supposed to be other things that we're supposed to be doing with our lives than what most of us are doing. And we either have to all get on that page or not make it. I want to make it. I believe we can make it, but we have to really shift where our attention is. Our attention is just on the wrong stuff.
Dr. Tiffany Willoughby Herard, thank you so much for taking time to chat to me. It's been a pleasure tapping into your beautiful mind, and I will definitely treasure everything that I can tap into now, not even just physically, just getting into your work now going forward, knowing that I have had a beautiful conversation with you. So basically your work, for me, I'll see it in a different light, obviously, right now. And I do hope to certainly meet you in person once again for another chat in future. When you're in South Africa, when you visit us, that would be great. But thank you so much. This has been very insightful. And I do hope that you guys remain safe there. And until we chat again.
Be well, Rebecca. Take good care. Hey? Bless you.
Thank you so much. And when just one thing, how do I now, or I just stop the recording and then I can send it over?
You should be able to, it'll save on your own computer.
Okay.
And since we both are recording, it'll save on mine also. But I won't
just
cut out until, right.
I don't want to lose it. Yeah, please.
I won't cut off until I make sure I know how to do it.
All right.